Let's get started with this second session from the World Access to Higher Education Day 2022. Thank you very much to NEON and the World Access to Higher Education Network for joining hands with us at UNESCO's International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we are also bringing in people from a number of different organizations to have this second session on advocating for a rights-based approach to higher education. Now, in this session, we have interpretation in English and in Spanish and in international sign. I am not confident to give you the instructions for how to shift between them, but I'm sure somebody can put a note in the chat of the webinar or can jump in now. But you should have an interpretation button on your screen so you can switch between them. So we're going to be speaking in this panel using English and Spanish. So if you need, please make sure that you have interpretation enabled. So you see here that in this session, we're going to be really thinking about access in a kind of broader perspective as a rights-based approach to higher education. So I'm Emma Sabzalieva, I'm Head of Research and Foresight at UNESCO IESALC. We have a superb panel joining us today, and we will go through and introduce people as they start. I'll explain a little bit about the format whilst you're looking at the names of the people that you see here. So what we want to do in this panel is think collectively in the light of reinvigorated efforts by UNESCO to place the right to higher education at the heart of the evolving right to education agenda. We wanted to bring together experts from different places with different backgrounds, but who have a shared commitment to elevating the right to higher education. So over the course of the next hour or so, we're going to have some discussion among the panelists, but also bringing in those of you who are joining us from around the world today. Now, particularly, we have an in-depth focus through our panelists' expertise on Latin America and Africa, which I think is super exciting, but we are also going to think in international perspective. So we want to gather insights from the experts that we have with us and discuss emerging challenges, brainstorm together about what opportunities we might have when we're thinking about advocating for the right to higher education. So in terms of the format, what I'm going to do is first introduce the panelists, and then I have an opening question that I'm going to ask each person to speak about. Now, we're going to be very strict with time because we want to make sure that, we respect everybody's day and what they, can bring in the different voices. So I'm actually going to put a timer on. So when I've asked the panelists to keep with a response of 3 minutes, I really mean it. So we'll try our best. So once we've done that initial question, which will go to everybody, we've then got some different questions, which kind of draw from the specific areas of expertise that each of the panelists bring today. We'll make a break in the middle to take questions and comments, and then another time at the end, towards the end of the session, to do the same thing. So that's a little bit about who we are, what we're going to do today, and a quick plug. A bit of publicity, if I may, for the work that IESALC is coordinating on the right to higher education. So we have our web pages either in English or in Spanish. So I'd encourage you using the QR code to find out more. And then for those of you who are among our Spanish speaking friends, I also just want to give you a heads up that in December, we're going to be organizing a youth and student dialogue specifically on issues to do with the right to higher education, focusing on Latin America and Caribbean context. So one of my colleagues will put a link in the chat so that you can subscribe to our newsletter and get more information about who it is that we'd like to engage in this dialogue and how you might be able to help and join efforts with us on the right to higher education. So I'm going to turn off the screen now. Hopefully then we can bring up the panelists and see them on screen as well. So let's get going with the first question that I'd like to ask to everybody today. It's quite a simple one. So why is it important to have a rights-based approach when we talk about higher education? So let me go by alphabet based on last name. So I'm going to start with Elizabeth Bernal. So Elizabeth is the academic coordinator of the Colombian Association of Universities, ASCUN, and a professor at Universidad Nacional de Colombia. She's been an expert advisor, researcher, project manager, and academic administrator in higher education with universities, consulting firms, with the Convenio Andrés Bello and the Ministry of National Education. She has an extensive teaching record, publications relating to university management, 2030 agenda, and so on. Without further ado, Elizabeth, let me pass the floor to you. I'm going to put my timer on my phone for 3 minutes. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Bueno, no, muchísimas gracias por la invitación. Voy a hablar en español gracias a esta invitación de diálogo multilingüe. Bueno, pues el tema del enfoque de derecho, pues para Colombia y para América Latina es un reto. Y el enfoque de derecho, como lo ha planteado la UNESCO, es muy necesario. Yo diría brevemente que es necesario por 3 elementos fundamentales. El primero, porque cuando se habla del derecho a la educación en términos muy generales, pasa, como ha sucedido en mi región, que se toma como educación básica solamente, educación primaria, o en ocasiones se incluye educación secundaria, pero no necesariamente se incluye educación superior. Entonces vale la pena tener un enfoque de derecho a la educación superior que dé respuesta a este proceso histórico, que si en efecto estuvimos primero pensando en los primeros niveles, es hora de que la educación superior acoja este enfoque en toda su dimensión. El segundo eje, creo yo que digamos que contribuye el tema del enfoque de derecho, es la visión integral que este nos da y pues digamos el discurso que todos acá conocemos y manejamos. Entonces nos dicen, sí es acceso, pero ojo, no es solo acceso, la garantía del derecho. Sí es permanencia, pero tampoco solo eso, es graduación, es éxito académico, pero también es la contribución a disminuir desigualdades. También, además de eso, es la posibilidad de seguir reconociendo la diversidad, de aumentar la equidad. Entonces, la integralidad que trae el concepto mismo de derecho nos ayuda a llevar cambios también integrales y un acompañamiento integral desde la educación superior. Y creo que el tercer eje, y con este finalizo, es el tema de la crisis generada por la pandemia. Yo creo que si algo nos hemos dado cuenta es que las consecuencias negativas de la pandemia en términos de educación superior han sido diferenciadas. No todas las personas la han vivido de la misma manera, y en educación superior, en la deserción, en la reducción de posibilidades de investigación, etcétera, ha sido distinto según las poblaciones en las que digamos que acceden a la educación superior. Entonces, hoy más que nunca, después de esta gran crisis que vimos de la pandemia, necesitamos el enfoque de derecho para reconocer estas diferencias y pues para permitir que esos beneficios que trae la educación superior de los países pues sean igualmente recibidos por toda la población. Eso sería por ahora.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Perfect timing as well, Elizabeth. So just another reminder to those who are joining us today that we have interpretation in English and in Spanish to enable our multilingual conversation. We also have international sign available, and that's pinned on the screen the whole time. So if you need to switch between languages, please, at the bottom of your screen, just use the interpretation button so that you can follow along in full. So the same question, please. Why is it important to have a rights-based approach when we talk about higher education? I'm going to turn next to Miriam Chiaba, who is the current and first Chief Executive Officer of the Zambia Qualifications Authority, a member of the Addis Convention Committee representing Zambia, immediate past chairperson of the African Qualifications Verification Network, and a former board member of the Groningen Declaration Network. She has been an expert on all kinds of committees and boards for UNESCO across the African region. And on top of all of that, she has extensive experience in strategy and finance and has worked both in government, financial sector and the private sector in Zambia as well. Miriam, thank you very much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you to everyone. I will look at the question in this way, basically to say why or what is it that we get when we go through higher education? And should that right should that not be a right? So basically, I look at the fact that when you go through higher education, it provides you with an opportunity to be a better person, a better citizen, in that you get skills that you are able to use. You have opportunity to be able to contribute more positively to your economy, to your social, environment, to the community. And therefore, if we do not take a rights-based approach, it means we are denying some of our people the access to the opportunity to have a skill, to be good at financial analysis, to be good at, being an agriculturist, be good at what it is that they need to do to contribute more effectively to society. So it is important, therefore, then for us, much as we speak about primary education, access to education and so on, we should take it all the way through the ladder of education to ensure that all our people have an opportunity to contribute to the economic development of the country, the region, and so on. And higher education is where they are able to get that, because the competences and knowledge, skill, and competences they are able to get from the higher education sector is something that will enable them to do that. So yes, we need to have that right-based approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miriam, for those opening remarks. I'm going to turn the same question back. We're going to flip back across continents. We're going to head to Brazil, and I'm going to introduce Rosana Heringa, who's a member of the board of the Latin American Campaign for the Right to Education, CLADE. She has a PhD in sociology and is currently an associate professor at the College of Education at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and coordinates the Laboratory of Studies and Research in Higher Education at that university. She's previously been Deputy Director of the College of Education, and has been a visiting professor and a Fulbright Scholar in the US, and again brings with her extensive experience and background in this area. Rosana, welcome to the panel. The floor is yours for 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you for the invitation, for being with you here today. Well, I think that we need a rights-based approach to talk about higher education, mainly because of 3 reasons. First, because we face huge inequalities in access and retention in higher education. So we have to consider that we don't have the same opportunities of access to all the groups in our populations. And when talking in a Latin American perspective, this has become even more difficult, as Elizabeth said, after the pandemic. And the other aspect is that we don't have our states fully taking full responsibility for guaranteeing, for supporting and financing higher education in our countries. So we see, on the other hand, a huge wave of privatization, and we really see that we don't have enough of public resources for this this level of education. So this is another reason. And also because I think I will also reinforce what Elizabeth said, that it's not only an issue of access, but also an issue of how we can guarantee retention policies, and we can guarantee successful training for those that are able to access higher education, because we have parts of our population, like underrepresented groups, like minorities, like low-income students that don't have the possibility of enjoying all the opportunities that higher education can bring. And then this is not only an issue for these people, mainly young people, but not only young people, but it's also something that benefits the whole society, as Miriam said. So I think we are all converging on the importance of higher education, not only for those that benefit directly, but also to those to the whole population of the country in terms of economy development, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, you know, that brings us to a couple of points actually, which I could add here. So I think from our perspective at IESALC, when we've been working on the right to higher education, so we agree that access to higher education is so critical, but it's one part of the puzzle. And, you know, we also have to consider, you know, what happens once students are in higher education, but then also their post-study trajectories, not just, you know, in the workforce, of course, but like their contribution to society and their own role as an individual. And I think, Rosanna, you've touched both on that, but also on then the role of, you know, higher education for society more broadly. Many thanks indeed for your response. We're going to move to Mexico now. Joshua Medina has joined us. He's a lawyer, a student, and the current vice president of the Federation of University Students at the Universidad de Guadalajara in Mexico. So since he was elected in 2019, he's participated in multiple student mobilizations and campaigns to defend the rights of students across the state, including fairer access, student resources, and university autonomy. Joshua, thanks so much for joining us. So the question everybody is taking their first 3 minutes on is this: why is it important to have a rights-based approach when we talk about higher education? Over to you, Joshua.
Muchísimas gracias y excelente día a todas y a todos. Bueno, desde nuestro punto de vista, que siempre ha sido la lucha estudiantil o el movimiento estudiantil, sobre todo en México, en una universidad pública que se sustenta a partir de recursos federal y estatal, sobre todo, es la universidad que mayor matrícula tiene en el occidente de mi país y que además en evaluaciones es de las mejores universidades en calidad académica, y sin embargo ha perdido bastante presupuesto, y tiene que ver también con cómo los gobiernos no tienen una prioridad de inversión en torno a la educación y a la garantía de la educación, ni media superior siquiera, y mucho menos la superior, e invertir, que haya gobiernos que inviertan y que haya todo un plan de desarrollo estratégico para invertir en educación es fundamental, sobre todo en un país como el nuestro, en donde la brecha de desigualdad es amplia, es profunda, es abismal, y que los retos que nos enfrentamos todos los días no es solamente la oportunidad de tener un espacio en la educación, sino todas las condiciones que hay en torno a esa calidad de educación que podemos tener, ¿no? Desde el cómo llegamos a nuestras escuelas, cómo nos movilizamos, las herramientas que tenemos para poder estudiar, no solamente lo que nos enseñan en las aulas, sino todas las herramientas que tenemos para poder estudiar de la mejor manera, la calidad educativa y demás, pues bueno, tiene que ver con toda una inversión de infraestructura educativa, no solamente con el acceso de manera directa a la herramienta de ya estar inscrito en una matrícula universitaria, sino también en todas las condiciones que no precisamente son las adecuadas. Y desde nosotros, que hemos encabezado desde el 2019 la lucha estudiantil en nuestra universidad, nos damos cuenta de las carencias que hay en cada uno de los espacios. Insisto, no solamente de la falta de oportunidades, porque en nuestra universidad, si bien es cierto, la educación media superior, por lo menos en Jalisco, a partir de la Universidad de Guadalajara, que es donde yo tengo la oportunidad de estudiar, la educación media superior tuvo una cobertura del 99%. Es decir, estamos a nada de construir la utopía de que la educación media superior sea garantizada para todas y para todos. Sin embargo, en la educación superior tenemos un reto importantísimo porque solamente el 30% tiene acceso. Es decir, tenemos completamente a personas sin ni siquiera la oportunidad de estudiar, que es el 70% de la demanda, llega a la universidad tratando de tener una oportunidad mejorar su calidad de vida, ¿no? Y vaya, esto hablamos de simplemente la inscripción. Si hacemos un análisis profundo de quienes se inscriben, quienes quedan con una matrícula o terminarse la matrícula.
Gonna jump right in and ask you just to wrap up for now. All right, we'll certainly come back on that one. Thank you so much for your introductory remarks. And I'm going to turn this first question. Thank you. I'm going to turn the first question over now to Abdoulaye Salifou. Abdoulaye, thanks so much for your patience and thank you for joining us. So Abdoulaye is a colleague at UNESCO. He's the Chief of Education at the UNESCO Liaison Office in Addis Ababa, the former secretary of the Addis Convention. He's a graduate of the Higher Administration School, has a PhD in communication with a specialization in ICT law and online learning. More than 25 years of professional experience. Prior to joining UNESCO in Addis earlier this year, he was regional advisor for higher education and ICT at the UNESCO regional office in Abuja in Nigeria. Again, Abdoulaye brings with him a wealth of expertise gained nationally, regionally, and internationally. Abdoulaye, thanks for joining us. Over to you for the first question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emma, and good warm greetings from Africa for all of you. Why is it so important to have a right-based approach when we talk about higher education? Whenever we talk about higher education, for instance, in Africa, for many decades, government and including international partners, for instance, World Bank, IMF, put emphasis on basic and secondary education. And higher education was a kind of a particular subsector of education which does not have a lot of fund to continue its development. But whenever we talk about higher education, we need to say that it is an issue of rights. For instance, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted in 1948 states that higher education should be equally accessible to all on the basis of merits. Here, merit needs mean to be considered in contests recognizing the potential to succeed of students in any context. So access to higher education is issue of rights. And when we refer to international agenda, for instance, the Millennium Agenda and another agenda, we notice that higher education was not part of the international agenda unless the Agenda 2030, particularly the target 4.1, which specifically aim by 2030 to ensure equal access for all women and men to affordable and quality technical, vocational, and tertiary education, including universities. And now, when we take into account particular students, let's say, for instance, among the 82 million refugees in the world, only 5% youth are enrolled in higher education, whereas the comparative figures for primary and secondary education were around 68% and 34% respectively, according to United Nations Higher Commissioner for Refugees. So, because of all that the situation I have just pointed out, we need to have a right approach because we need to reduce inequality. We need to take into account inclusion in higher education so that all of the students of the world, all of the children can have access to higher education. Of course, we know that
Abdoulaye.
Not only higher education that can build everything. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think just from this first round, we've got so many issues that we're bringing to the table already. You know, just from that last intervention, we've talked about issues of merit, We've talked about the, the growing number of refugees and their very low comparative access to higher education. So let's continue the conversation now and move in some different directions. At the same time, let me encourage those of you who are listening in, to post your questions, either using the Q&A or using the chat, and we'll try to take up as many of those as we can. Feel free to write in English or Spanish. We'll do our best. So, Rosanna, let me come back to you now, if I may. I'd like to ask you how you think we can effectively campaign for fair access to higher education for all.
Thank you. Well, I don't think this is an easy question to answer. I'll just put my time here quickly.
Don't worry, I'm timing
to counting. But I think one challenge that we have is how we can really demand for more resources, public resource for higher education. So this has to be done at national level, of course, but also I think our human rights organizations, our Right to Education campaign and other institutions and civil society organizations, we have to press our governments and also international cooperation agencies, etc., to really bring together the proposal of having enough of resource for the infrastructure, as Joshua was saying, for retention policies, and for all the other demands that we have in our public universities. Another aspect that I think is very important, I talk here more on the perspective of Latin America, but I think this may happen in other places, is how we can support the transition from high school to higher education. Because in our country, what we experience is that many times the potential students, the potential candidates that would apply to higher education, for example, to affirmative action policies, to special programs for underrepresented groups in higher education, they don't even have enough information about this. They don't even have enough of resources to know which would be their opportunities, which would be their possibilities. And so to do some kind of campaign and support that we can achieve high school students, public high school students in different places, even especially those in more low-income neighborhoods, in the outskirts of our big cities, in rural areas, in indigenous communities, so that this transition from high school to higher education may happen. And I still have a few seconds. I would also like to comment on what we can, when we talk about retention policies, I can come back to this later, but that we consider both the traditional financial support, but also what we call a sense of belonging, the perception of students that they can be part of the institution, that they are not like a fish out of the water, but they can really be part of this, and this is important for them to fight for their rights. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. And you mentioned, perhaps some of those issues might be, clearer to you within the context of Latin America. But I mean, let's see. Let me ask Abdullah now the same, to come in on the same thing. Maybe we see some similar or some different perspectives. So Abdullah, how can we effectively campaign for fair access to higher education for all?
Yes, thank you. In addition to what my colleague had just said, for us in Africa, first of all, we need again to show the importance of higher education in, for instance, in addressing the main challenges the continent are facing. First of all, education. Secondly, health, hunger, let's say also ICT, and peace and security. And secondly, we need the support of international organizations such as UNESCO for its legal instruments, mainly the convention, to put emphasis on the right to higher education. Thirdly, we need also to choose to help the member states to put in their policy while updating the policy, the rights to affirm the right of to higher education in their policy. And thirdly, we can give an example of some countries who put emphasis on the right of higher education. For instance, a country such as Liberia declared that tuition university fees will be free for all students undergrad at universities. So that's a few initiatives in way that we can campaign for fair access to higher education for all. Over to you.
Excellent. Abdullah, thank you very much indeed. I think we're really bringing out some important perspectives here. I'm going to turn now to the topic specifically of higher education as a human right. So I think we've talked about already, the fact that the right to education is enshrined in international law. We've also mentioned the fact that when we think about that right to education, we typically focus on school level education. But in fact, just this week, we've seen the World Conference on Early Childhood Education taking place in Tashkent in Uzbekistan. Earlier this year, we held the World Higher Education Conference. We've also had Compinter, a big international conference on adult education. So let's try to kind of really embrace the fact that education happens across the life spectrum. In doing that, though, then I guess that will raise a number of challenges. So let me ask first Miriam and then Jasua. Could you comment, please, on what you see as the most important challenges to guaranteeing higher education as a human right? And perhaps especially help us to think about students who, in your contexts, have been historically marginalized. Miriam, over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think when we look at the challenges that we face to guarantee us higher education, one of the things that we realize is that as a people, we have competing needs. So when we have our basic requirements to life, our basic needs not being met, and then you have education on top, then for the government, it becomes almost obvious to first meet the initial needs, the need to shelter, water, food, and so on before they even think about education. So that is something that really challenges us to now put education as a basic need. So that is something that is real, because economies are struggling, and so we see this struggle. Then how do we then put education as a right when we basically cannot even meet the other basic human rights? But then when you go down to the education system itself, in terms of issues on how one looks at admissions, for instance, rigid admission criteria, those are things that will hinder access to higher education and having higher education as a right, because you find, like for instance in Zambia, our qualifications framework says that if you have a school certificate, you've passed your grade 12, you can go into university. But there's extra criteria that the universities puts in on top of that to say, look, you need to get a credit before you enter. And yet with a school certificate, you should have access to higher education. So we have rigid assessment, admission criteria. The cost of higher education is high. There's limited student support to go with it. So student loans are limited. You have low investments in higher education infrastructure and so on. So you have all these limiting aspects that even further disadvantage the disadvantaged persons of the world, when you look at those with disabilities, if infrastructure, university is not properly constructed, they cannot have easy access. So those issues are some of the issues that then become a challenge to guaranteeing higher education as a human right, because countries, our systems can't just accommodate to give that on a fair and equal platform to ensure everybody has access. For now, thank you.
Miriam, thank you. I think it's really important to bring out those, really fundamental contrasts that you mention for governments that are having to deal with certain, having to deal with, as you mentioned, sort of these competing needs, both the basic requirements of food, shelter, and so on, and then where education at any level comes into that part of the conversation. Thank you. Jasper, can I put the same question to you? How about how we can sort of uphold higher education as a human right? So Jasper, would you like to make an intervention?
Sí, muchas gracias. Y además también contestar una pregunta que vi que me mandaron sobre qué tiene que hacer nuestra universidad o las instituciones para hacer una experiencia educativa mucho más igualitaria. Pues me parece que de entrada uno de los grandes retos es precisamente, lo escuchaba antes de mí, revisar los criterios de evaluación para que no sean criterios tan rígidos, pero incluso aún todavía siendo criterios de evaluación para la admisión más flexibles, no hay espacios. Simplemente tendríamos que apostarle a un esfuerzo colaborativo entre organización civil, ciudadanía, algunos organismos públicos y el mismo gobierno para poder generar una inversión mínima a la educación a nivel nacional. Es decir, mientras no haya un esfuerzo institucional para que la educación tenga una inversión mínima y que eso pueda garantizar el crecimiento de las universidades. En México, por ejemplo, nuestras universidades no crecen, sino que más bien decrecen. Cada semestre la admisión es menor porque la demanda es mayor, y si bien es cierto, en cantidad siguen admitiendo a la misma cantidad de personas, pues en demanda queda completamente lejano, ¿no? Es decir, en la demanda estamos completamente lejos de poder cubrir los mínimos de requerimientos. Y no solamente eso, uno de los grandes retos también para poder generar que la educación superior sea un derecho humano, pues tenemos que empezar desde la educación básica. Es decir, en países como el mío, la educación básica ni siquiera está cubierta al 100%, por ejemplo. Y pensar ya en cubrir la educación superior, pues también es pensar desde el privilegio de quienes sí tuvimos la oportunidad de acceder a la educación superior, pero volteemos a ver la educación básica, la primaria, secundaria, que no muchas personas tienen ni siquiera la posibilidad de acceder, y que además las condiciones de vida económicas y de desarrollo social no permiten de ninguna manera que comunidades enteras se puedan dedicar al estudio. En México, por ejemplo, en la Universidad de Guadalajara, hablando en nivel preparatoria o media superior, tenemos casos muy específicos que son escuelas en algunas zonas regionales, es decir, en las periferias de la ciudad, en donde para la comunidad de estudiantes es mucho más accesible involucrarse en el narcotráfico para poder trabajar y solventar los gastos de su casa que continuar con el estudio, que continuar en su educación media superior. Y también un ejemplo muy similar y muy preocupante es las comunidades completas que en vez de dedicarse a estudiar por la falta de oportunidades, terminan migrando a los Estados Unidos en busca de mejores condiciones de vida. Y eso lo vivimos en una ciudad muy grande en México, que es Guadalajara, a media hora, 45 minutos, una hora de distancia, en donde ya comunidades enteras, su situación económica no permite ni siquiera terminar la educación básica, y en la educación media superior no es una prioridad porque tienen prioridades de vida de qué van a comer, cómo van a vivir, dónde van a vivir, y todo ese tipo de preocupaciones es incluso un planteamiento mucho más detallado de lo que estábamos haciendo. No sé si todavía tengo tiempo porque yo no tengo cronómetro aquí.
Yeah.
Bueno, y
Well, there was
que es,
just thank you. I just want to kind of make one comment that what you've done actually is provided another perspective on this issue of migration, which Abdullah mentioned earlier in the context of refugees. So I think you know, we need to think about both the kind of outbound directionality of migration, but also the inbound impact that has on domestic higher education systems. There has been a question about, you know, in response, Jasser, to what you said before about higher education budgets are shrinking and the role of higher education institutions in promoting the right to higher education. So would any of our panelists like to take up that question specifically before we kind of move back to our next round? Meanwhile, before you kind of contribute, you know, I can see from the panelist list that we have people joining us from all over the world. So we're able to share quite a number of perspectives just, you know, on the basis of the experiences of our panelists. But I know that those of you who are joining us today also have perspectives. So please feel free, you know, if you have questions or comments that can help us understand these issues more broadly, please do post those. So Jasper, would you want to speak a little more about the role of higher education institutions?
sería muy breve, nada más. Creo que las instituciones tienen que pensar en el contexto general y global de quienes queremos acceder a la educación superior, porque mientras el análisis de las instituciones sea cómo generamos más espacios, pues es una visión muy limitada. Tiene que ser cómo generamos más espacios, pero con un contexto completamente distinto que le permita a la o el estudiante tener el mejor desarrollo en la educación superior. Creo que ese tiene que ser el enfoque. Es un enfoque mucho más global de condiciones de vida y no solamente de admisión a la educación superior. Eso es todo.
Thank you, Jasper. Rosanna, please.
Very quickly, just to say that our universities have also to have more responsibility on looking at the profile of the students that started to be able to join higher education institutions, because traditionally higher education has been built for an elite in most of our countries. And so when we have expansion of the system, when we have more students from different backgrounds joining our institutions, there is also this responsibility that is in the institution to provide what is needed by these, between commas, new students that come. So, yeah. Of course, the resources are limited, but I think there is a perspective here that has to be adopted by our universities. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rosanna. I think, you know, that's a really helpful reminder as well that, you know, it's not necessarily the responsibility only of the student to transform. The institution needs to transform to support the students, especially given its historic roots. And, you know, for many of us, depending on our global setting, you know, the university is an imposed institution that comes from a period of colonialism and was designed exactly as you said, just for an elite. Miriam and Abdullah, I saw both of you at points raised your hand. Maybe Abdullah and then Miriam, please.
Okay, thank you very much. For me, I want to point out one opportunity that higher education have today and to widen access to the higher education, particularly when we are talking about lifelong learning. A higher education is one of the best paths, best windows to open access to lifelong learning through the recognition of competencies, the qualification, and also that modern students, even in the professional who are already working, can enroll themselves in higher education institution in the perspective of lifelong learning. And this is very important because, as we know, we have also the students coming from TVET, technical vocational education training. They also need a path to join higher education. So we need, frankly speaking, from our side, in terms of higher education institution, to open access to lifelong learning for all of us. That's the point I want to add.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's useful to remind us that the transition is not just from primary to secondary to higher education, but also, you know, in and out of higher education throughout, as you said, the life course. Thank you, Abdullahi. Miriam, over to you. And then I see we have another question in the chat.
Okay, so basically I was going to say what Abdullahi has said and what Rosanna said, but really just to say the higher education institutions need to be innovative in their way they do business now. So they need to think outside the box, ensure that the admissions are basically looking broader than being narrow and being rigid, look at how they can, you know, look at the costs of actually providing. So looking at the profile of the student that they are trying to attract, and have different options, entry options for the different classes of, you know, students, where they're recognizing those that are differently abled and so on and so forth. But nutshell is they have to be innovative in how to ensure that there's access into the higher education sector. Thank you.
Excellent. Miriam, maybe I can follow up with you. You know, in your position in Zambia Qualifications Authority, you know, you must be very familiar with the institutions across the country. Are there any examples of innovative practice that you could give us?
So what we've seen in Zambia actually is, especially the private higher education institutions, they have basically firstly looked at the cost of training. And I think in some cases, they're barely just breaking even. So they offer very competitive pricing, such that those that are not able to go into our public universities, they're actually able to go in some private universities, because the pricing, the costing of the, you know, learning there is tailored towards the different, you know, groups, but more especially the socially disadvantaged. One other thing that we've seen is that the higher education institutions are offering scholarships directly themselves, not through government, because most of them will go through the government student support and so on. But the universities themselves offer scholarships for, they will have different categories. And in that, you can see that they are promoting access, especially for the disadvantaged, and, you know, is a part of the economy. So you tend to see that. For admission criteria, a number of them will offer the basic one that basically says, you know, as long as you have a school certificate, you can get into university. However, the policies that exist for quality assurance through the regulators, the Higher Education Authority, for instance, where they demand that the students must have a minimum X, you know, grade, that tends to then work against that innovation of allowing students in, even with just a mere pass at O-level certification. So maybe those are some of the examples I can cite.
No, those are excellent. Thank you, Miriam. And let me relate that to the comment that's just come through in the chat that I hope everyone can see, which connects exactly to what your final point on accreditation. So there's also, I think, the suggestion from Lawrence is that accreditation institutions, thank you, Lawrence from Ghana, who have to think outside the box and expand their accreditation framework to recognize certificates that emanate as a result of new innovation. So some interesting points there. And maybe Elizabeth, can I, ask you to chime in? So, Miriam has this sort of overview in the Zambian context. Similarly, you can see across what's happening in Colombia. Maybe there are some innovations that you could bring to our attention.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Pues yo estoy muy de acuerdo con lo que se ha planteado y creo además que es muy importante algo que ya han venido mencionando y es tener una perspectiva sistémica de la corresponsabilidad para la garantía del derecho. Porque claro, si nosotros decimos, por ejemplo, lo que se acaba de mencionar, no, las instituciones deberían abrir espacios, etcétera, innovar, y eso está muy bien y deberían hacerlo, pero, y la discusión que se está haciendo, si hay un sistema de calidad que les está exigiendo que se aparten un poco de esta concepción, lo que les está exigiendo son productos académicos de último nivel, lo que les está exigiendo son resultados altos de los exámenes. Entonces tenemos acá una visión sistémica que se rompe, porque si hay instituciones que quieren hacer avances en esta línea, pues tenemos un marco nacional que puede estarles limitando su actuación. Entonces yo creo que es muy importante generar justo estas visiones de cómo los distintos actores en los países y también en las regiones están participando y cómo se articulan para efectivamente hacer del derecho una garantía y que vaya más allá de la declaración en una política. Y creo también que hay el tema de la innovación es importante, algo que nosotros, por ejemplo, hemos vivido en Colombia y que pues hemos tenido la fortuna de acompañar desde la asociación, son iniciativas interinstitucionales. Entonces, por ejemplo, nosotros tenemos un programa con jóvenes en condiciones especiales y lo que hacemos es que como ASCUN enviamos al programa, involucramos a distintas instituciones para que respondan de manera como puede cada institución, de tal manera que acojan a los estudiantes desde que seleccionan el programa de formación hasta el final que ingresan en el mercado laboral. Entonces ahí no estamos dejando a las instituciones solas, a que cada institución se piense una estrategia y asuma la responsabilidad de manera aislada, sino que nos constituimos como un articulado, evaluamos las capacidades de cada institución y a partir de esas capacidades vamos remitiendo, digamos, en este caso, jóvenes de acuerdo con cierta tipología. Entonces ahí es, por ejemplo, instituciones que tienen un programa de bienestar muy fuerte, pues pueden llegar a coger un grupo más y tenemos que darles menos apoyo que otras. Pero creo que eso es fundamental, tenemos que pensar en un trabajo interinstitucional, tenemos que tener una perspectiva sistémica para la garantía del derecho y además creo que en línea con lo que planteaba ahora Miriam, yo creo que también tenemos que avanzar en innovaciones, en pensar que tenemos que iniciar estrategias y programas distintos que tengan ojalá mayor impacto.
Muchísimas gracias, Elizabeth. I think actually your comments help connect us very nicely to the next set of questions. So we have some more comments in the chat and a question in the Q&A. Please keep those coming. For now, I'm going to come back to the panel and then at the end, we'll pick up on some of these issues as well. So I really wanted to turn to this point about policy. Elizabeth just started to mention it in her response. So thinking both about national policies, given that higher education, whether it's private or public, is ultimately still governed primarily by the state, but also institutional level policies. And let's think about the role that those policies play in protecting higher education as a human right. So that's sort of on the one hand, but then I guess the question that I'd like to ask first to Abdullah, and then we'll come back to Elizabeth again, is what we can do to hold governments and higher education institutions accountable to that right. Abdullah, can I give the floor to you?
Yes, thank you very much. For my side, first of all, we need to recall our government that international organization today puts higher education as a priority. And they link higher education to basic, secondary, and TVET in a holistic approach, so that in each policy that the government wants to put in place, they need to think about the linkage between the three subsectors, including TVET. This is the first one. The second one is to show clearly that higher education institutions are not the industry of unemployment. So what does it mean? Does it mean that we need to linkage our higher education institution to TVET so that the students who are coming from secondary school TVET can have a path, a window access to technical vocational higher education? Because the challenges the countries are facing today is a massive employment of youth. As far as we will not, our higher education institution will not solve this problem, we will have these difficulties to widen access to higher education. This is the first one. The second one is that our government must release on also the international, regional, international treaties, conventions that are supporting higher education at continental and globally. And thirdly, of course, they need to open, an innovative way to open higher education, not only a physical one. We have this experience of COVID-19 that now we are doing higher education remotely. But we need to also increase what we can call the virtual laboratories that will support the online courses. Because if I am in a TVET school, I need some equipment, but we can simulate through the virtual laboratories. So that is the few ideas I want to share. Over to you, Emma. Thank you.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you, Abdullah. It's so much food for thought. And I think I have to, just with my UNESCO hat, mention again the issue of the conventions that you brought up, because I think it connects very well with the previous points about migration. So we're thinking also about supporting students who may not just remain in a domestic higher education system, but also allowing for the possibility that whether by choice or by force, people have to move across borders. And if we continue to have our higher education systems organized by national borders, then we also need to have a system that goes beyond that, which says that a qualification you have in Colombia is recognized in Zambia, is recognized in Mexico. And if you want to continue your studies in a lifelong way, that you have the ability to do that. So UNESCO has developed the Global Convention on the Recognition of Qualifications, which we hope will come into force soon. It's awaiting final ratifications by a certain number of member states. But we also have, as Abdullah mentioned, regional conventions, perhaps most successfully in Europe and in Africa with the Lisbon and the Addis conventions. And here we can wave the flag for Latin America and the Caribbean, because just last month, our new regional convention came into force. I think we're going to be calling it the Buenos Aires Convention, although we are still working on the name. So, we have also these regional conventions to promote that kind of cross-border recognition of higher education at that level. So excuse me for making my own intervention when I'm supposed to be asking the question, but I couldn't resist the opportunity to do that. Elizabeth, come on, let's turn back to you. So how do we hold national governments, how do we hold higher education institutions accountable for upholding this right to higher education? Over to you. Thank you.
Bueno, Emma, muchas gracias. Y sí, a propósito de la convención global que mencionas, ASCUN está presidiendo Enlaces, que es el espacio latinoamericano y caribeño de educación superior, y ese es un punto importante y es uno de los puntos que estamos trabajando. Así que está pasando con esta comunicación entre la educación superior en distintos países, que sabemos que es un reto mayor. Digamos, nosotros lo vivimos dentro de nuestros países. Que un estudiante que sale de una institución de educación superior sea admitido a otra es un reto aún, pues hacerlo a nivel internacional sabemos que sigue siendo un reto, pero hay que seguir trabajando en ello. Y bueno, a propósito de la pregunta específicamente, bueno, algo que nosotros, y yo creo que América Latina y en general creo que muchos países sigue siendo un dolor, y es que estos temas dejen de ser un tema propio o una política de gobierno, y sean más una política de Estado. Es decir, que independientemente de los cambios de gobierno, haya elementos estructurales, compromisos de país que no puedan ser transformados por la llegada de un gobierno distinto, que haya programas que no puedan ser acabados y reiniciados simplemente porque haya algunos cambios o modificaciones importantes. Entonces creo que uno de los elementos fundamentales es que las políticas sigan siendo políticas que se construyan con la población, con las instituciones de educación superior, que son las que le pueden dar continuidad y sostenibilidad, que sean políticas pensadas a largo plazo. Y otro tema que nosotros venimos planteando es que todos sabemos que para que una política sea realidad, pues necesita estrategias y necesita recursos. Y los recursos, lo que nosotros hemos visto y pasó en Colombia con un programa, es que se generaron recursos muy importantes para un programa y el programa terminó no siendo lo que se esperaba y no benefició a un número importante de estudiantes y claramente no benefició a los estudiantes que se quería beneficiar. Entonces creo que hay un tema allí y es el uso eficiente de los recursos y el seguimiento a cómo se están utilizando esos recursos. Porque a veces se dice, invertimos tanto dinero en un programa y cuando uno revisa la evaluación o el impacto del programa, resulta que pues no se compara con los recursos allí planteados y sobre todo pues ya se planteaba cuando vemos una disminución de recursos tenemos que ser muy eficientes en el uso. Desafortunadamente también tenemos otro dolor en América Latina que es el tema de la corrupción. Tenemos que estar allí todo el tiempo vigilando que estos recursos pues no caigan para objetivos privados. Y creo que terminaría con otros dos elementos. Uno es que en algunas políticas gubernamentales se hace mucho énfasis al control, ¿no? Entonces, como le pido rendición de cuentas a las instituciones, bien sea educación superior u otras, pero no necesariamente o no siempre se hace en coherencia con el fomento. Entonces, por ejemplo, hay instituciones que requerirían un apoyo para la toma de decisiones, por ejemplo, un apoyo para la gestión, una gestión que tenga un enfoque de derecho. Entonces, algo que planteamos es una política debe incluir estrategias de fomento, de acompañamiento.
Brilliant. Thank you. So we're going to, having picked up on those sort of multiple issues there.
Pero nadie los
I think Elizabeth's connection has gone a bit, so I'll invite her to continue later on if there's some final remarks that she wants to make. I'd like to sort of focus specifically, and we can, on the role of students in higher education and how we can meaningfully engage with students to empower them in advocacy efforts. Here, I think we could turn first to Jasua, and then I'll invite Rosanna to take the floor. So Jasua, can I ask you for your ideas about that?
Claro, muchísimas gracias. Bueno, creo que más bien estoy convencido que la responsabilidad de quienes estudiamos o quienes queremos acceder a ese derecho es total. Es decir, si nosotros como comunidad estudiantil, como juventud, no nos movilizamos para exigir los mínimos, tiene que ver desde el cómo colaboramos en mesas de trabajo para poder hacer planteamientos, dialogar y demás. Sin embargo, hay veces que nos encontramos con gobiernos muy autoritarios que no precisamente se prestan al diálogo y simplemente con el hecho de invitarles e invertir más en educación, pues suceden las cosas. Aquí en mi universidad, por ejemplo, tenemos desde hace 2 años una lucha en las calles a través de la manifestación, a través de la invitación al diálogo, a través de la cultura, de las artes, una manifestación permanente para exigir al gobierno que invierta más en educación, que le permita a la universidad construir más aulas y que le permita a la universidad tener una educación mucho más integral para todas y para todos. Y la manera de empoderar a las y los estudiantes es invitándoles a participar, como hoy, por ejemplo, yo estoy muy agradecido de que me inviten a participar en este panel, porque es de las pocas oportunidades que tengo de reflexionar la universidad o las universidades que necesitamos nosotras y nosotros los estudiantes. Y la manera de empoderar es precisamente esa, invitar a la comunidad estudiantil a que forme parte de los análisis y por lo tanto también de la toma de decisiones y que se construyan con ellas y con ellos las rutas de la defensa de sus universidades, de la universidad y la educación superior en su país, en su estado y en el mundo entero. Porque solamente abriendo espacios de opinión, de diálogo, de discusión con nosotras y nosotros los estudiantes, es la única manera que tenemos para poder plantear nuestras preocupaciones y también ayudar a la defensa de esta educación superior y que incluso también incentivando a que existan organismos o más bien grupos organizados de estudiantes en las universidades, porque tal vez no es el caso de las universidades que están aquí representadas, pero sí hay casos o antecedentes de universidades a las cuales les es muy preocupante o les es muy, o les asusta mucho que la comunidad estudiantil se organice, porque cuando ven a la comunidad estudiantil organizada, siempre genera mucho ruido, mucho escepticismo de cómo van a avanzar en lo que trabajen. Y bueno, en la experiencia personal, lo que hemos podido construir, lo que exigimos todos los días y la lucha que tenemos en las calles, en las mesas de diálogo y en los órganos de gobierno de nuestra universidad, pues es una lucha constante. Y esa es la manera de empoderarnos, pidiéndonos nuestra opinión, invitándonos a participar y tomando en cuenta también los análisis que tenemos nosotros y nosotros, porque igual no es un análisis totalmente académico, no es un análisis de estudio como tal, en torno a qué tenemos que hacer, pero sí es un análisis completamente empírico, porque quienes vivimos y sufrimos todos los obstáculos para poder acceder a la educación superior, pues somos quienes seguimos estudiando o quienes aspiramos a seguir estudiando a la educación superior. Entonces, me parece que es fundamental. Yo pondría incluso como prioritaria la participación de las y los estudiantes en la lucha por el derecho a la educación superior. Es prioritaria.
Yeah, Jasso, I thank you. I couldn't agree with you more. This conversation has to be multi-generational. We have to think not only about, you know, those of us who've been through higher education or somehow have some responsibility for higher education now, but people who are studying now and people also who might be students in the future. So I really think that's a critical moment that you've raised here. Rosanna, what about you? You know, one of the things Jasso mentioned was about the type of government, how that affects student participation. That's clearly an important question for Brazil and for elsewhere. But talk to us a bit about how we can engage students in advocacy efforts on the right to higher education. Over to you.
Thank you. I totally agree with what Jasso just said. I think it's fundamental that we have this participation of students at all levels. And I would add the need of making it possible for students to participate in decision-making process inside the institutions, inside the universities. I agree with him when he says sometimes the universities are afraid of this type of participation, but I don't think we are going to move forward if we don't really consider this participation of students in different levels. And here I speak first at the level of the curriculum. I think the students have great contributions in terms of discussing new issues, new demands, new subjects that have to be addressed. For instance, in Brazil, the more we have indigenous students, the more we have Afro-Brazilian students in our universities. That is a change that has happened in the last 20 years. We have also a diversification of the content of what is being considered relevant to be taught in our university. So this is fundamental. And also in terms of the possibility of how to say this, just a moment, not having only a single thought, you know, a single a single definition, a single understanding about everything. So we have this possibility of multicultural, intercultural possibilities that will bring more engagement of students. And I think this is fundamental. Thank you.
Many thanks, Rosanna, also for bringing into the conversation these important issues, not only about diversity and representation, but diversity in our, in our curriculum, in our research. So what are the worldviews that we're thinking about? How are these sort of put forward when it comes to higher education? Let me just sort of note again that in December, we're going to be hosting an open space for people who are interested in helping us to try and engage more youth in issues of right to higher education in Latin America and the Caribbean. So please join us for that if you'll be available in December. Well, not the final question, but the one that's the last on my list for today picks up on some issues perhaps mentioned a little bit by Miriam earlier, coming up, I think, also in the chat. The private sector, which plays an important role, however we conceive of that, in higher education in Africa and Latin America, as well as in, of course, many other parts of the world. And in fact, in Brazil, we know that we have 75% of students enrolled in private higher education compared to just 25% in publicly funded institutions. So when we're thinking about this kind of context with a heavy dominance of private higher education, what do you see as the prospects to guarantee equal access to higher education? Let me ask Elizabeth first, and then we'll go back to Miriam on this one. Elizabeth, what would you say on this?
Bueno, en efecto, es un tema que hay que trabajarlo. En Colombia, por ejemplo, el 50%, cerca del 50% de la matrícula en educación superior está en instituciones de educación superior privada por un tema pues histórico y cultural que tenemos, y bueno, que nos acercamos un poco allá a Chile, y allí se diferencia de otros países de América Latina. Yo creo que es muy importante involucrar al sector privado en el tema de equidad, y para ello hemos identificado algunas líneas, uno que incluso ya se alcanzó a esbozar, y es que la equidad sea un indicador de calidad. Si empieza a exigirse, digamos, algunos elementos de equidad, empieza a medirse, empiezan a solicitarse evidencias de compromiso con la equidad en instituciones, tanto públicas como privadas, para acceder, bien sea al certificado obligatorio de calidad o a certificaciones que implican alta calidad. Creo que eso va a mover a las instituciones en esa vía. Y justo con eso lo que se podría indicar es que las instituciones, pues primero, asuman su rol en los proyectos de vida de las personas que hacen parte de los lugares específicos, de los territorios en los que habitan. Es decir, que las instituciones sepan que están haciendo parte del proyecto de vida de sus estudiantes, pero también de las comunidades en las que están ubicadas o en las que tienen alguna acción, y en ese sentido deben tener un compromiso con el tema de la equidad. Hay otro elemento que nos parece muy importante, y a propósito de eso, ahora les puedo compartir el enlace. Hicimos una publicación con Yamil Salmi y Marta Laverde sobre el tema de medición de la equidad. Es decir, tenemos que medir, tenemos que generar indicadores, tenemos que hacerle seguimiento a cómo estamos en términos de equidad, un poco en línea de lo que planteábamos, en línea de revisar si las políticas están funcionando o no, y cómo nos vemos en términos de país y, por supuesto, en términos de región. En esta medición tenemos un reto y es identificar grupos objeto de equidad, y esto, como ya se ha planteado, es muy complejo en países en general, y pues en América Latina es porque tenemos grupos sujetos de equidad por género, lo que plantearon de migración, por condiciones socioeconómicas. Incluso nosotros tenemos puesto el tema del conflicto, víctimas del conflicto armado, o sea, tenemos incluso interseccionalidades para medir la equidad. Entonces es complejo, pero hay que seguirlo haciendo, y hay que involucrar al sector privado en esta medición, en que reporte y además en que contribuya a la construcción de indicadores para medición. Y finalmente, pues también motivarlo a que genere estrategias tanto monetarias como no monetarias para el apoyo a la equidad, es decir, que impliquen recursos frescos, claves, y que muestre cuántos recursos se está invirtiendo en este, como otras que sean más de tipo simbólico o de otro tipo. Bueno, ya me sonó mi cronómetro. Gracias.
Thank you very much again, Elizabeth. Interesting that you've brought to the table the issue of measuring, something which I know our colleagues at NEON, who organized World Access to Higher Education Day, have also pointed out is kind of rife with difficulty, particularly when we think across global contexts. We have to think about, who are our vulnerable students, and how are they the same or different across different contexts. That, I think, is one issue that makes it a little bit difficult to look internationally, but also thinking about the other legislation in each country that might hinder, for data protection or purposes, the collection of such data. So I'm really glad that you've brought this issue to the table. But Miriam, let me turn sort of to you as well, please. So thinking again specifically about the context of privatization and a mix of public and private higher education, and how might we guarantee equal access to higher education in such contexts?
I think I have one addition, really. I think it's to look at how responsive the governments are, because all this, for it to thrive, we need enabling policies. So one prospect is the policies that our governments have in place to ensure that they embrace the change to support private sector participation properly in the education sector. And maybe just to throw in that maybe one of the things is obviously effectively promote partnerships with the private sector in the provision of higher education. That is a prospect that will guarantee that. So basically, when there's this partnership, I think it's a win-win situation, and whatever impediments the private sector has are things that then can be worked out through these partnerships. But also, if they require policy changes, the governments need to be responsive to ensure that they then create an enabling environment for the private sector to thrive. Thanks.
Okay, Miriam, thank you very much. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I can see that we have some sort of questions that have come through, some comments as well, which are in the chat. Some of those comments, interestingly, have brought up various, I think we would think about them as equity deserving groups, so groups of students who have been historically marginalized, perhaps who are more likely to be vulnerable than others. So I think that's been very important for us to bring up on the agenda today. There's also been a question which I thought might be worth addressing now from Siajabo. I'll just go back up to find that. I think it was from Siajabo. Yes, about research that's done. So pointing out, which I think is correct, that we do have a growing body of research on higher education, on equity, on equality. But what do we do with that research? That's I think a perennial question for those who work, and produce research, to say, how do you get people to listen to the recommendations that come from the research? So how do you kind of really ensure that that knowledge gets mobilized? I wonder, would any of our panelists like to offer some suggestions or some perhaps examples that you've seen where that has worked effectively? Or indeed from among our audience who are here joining us, perhaps you have some examples to share. So that's one question that we can put out on the agenda. The other point I would just like to give the floor back to the panelists, and again to people who are listening. Is there anything that's kind of come up today that you want to say anything more about? equally, is there anything that hasn't been said which you think we should put on our virtual table today? Rosanna?
Yes, regarding the question about how we can have more contributions from students, from research that are being done, I think the most important issue is communication, is how we go beyond our own walls of our institutions, and we can communicate with a broader public. Here in our country, there's something very curious that happens. Now, sometimes people that go to the media, to the most important media to comment on education policy are not people from the universities, are people from other sectors. And so I think there is a demand for our voices to be heard, because research is being done, and we have to make it possible to spread the results. So not only from our students, but from the researchers in our institutions. And I think this would be like the last comment. I don't know if you have time for more. I also would like to comment on the issue of internationalization of higher education. We didn't talk so much about this here, but I think Elizabeth and Miriam have brought the issue of accreditation, of how we can communicate among our countries in terms of the challenge that we have regarding that. And it's very curious because there is this huge demand for internationalization all the time, everywhere. So we have still so many difficulties, but at the same time, there is this from students, they have this demand, and also from our institutions. So this is a requirement of quality many times, and how internationalized you are. And then we still don't find the best ways to make this simple, and that this can make a huge contribution for the training for the students. So I would add that, because I think we need another seminar just to talk about this. Thank you.
Well, that's an open invitation to Graham to invite us back. We'd be happy, I think, to continue the conversation for sure. Elizabeth, and then Abdullah.
Gracias, Emma. Bueno, a propósito de lo que planteabas de temas, hay algo que a mí me parece importante y lo estamos discutiendo ahorita en Colombia y en el espacio también de América Latina, y es que hemos visto que en algunos lugares está disminuyendo la demanda por educación superior. Es decir, hay menos estudiantes queriendo acceder a educación superior. Entonces esto nos abrió una pregunta muy grande: ¿qué está pasando? ¿No? Porque ya no se trata solo, como lo que planteaba ahora Yasua con México, de muchos estudiantes queriendo ingresar y que algunas instituciones por sus capacidades tienen que filtrar y solo escoger unos pocos, sino que estamos viendo que están apareciendo lugares en los que hay pocos, que a pesar de que tengamos la capacidad, hay cada vez menos estudiantes queriendo ingresar a educación superior. Y esto creo que es un tema que tenemos que analizar, porque hay distintos elementos que están llevando a esta situación. Hay elementos como situaciones desfavorables previas, lo que se ha comentado, estudiantes que están desertando de la educación básica o de la educación media, ¿no? Estudiantes también que no encuentran, digamos, las condiciones, que no están viendo en la educación superior la respuesta a sus necesidades. Necesitamos también pensar en que tenemos que generar ciertas transformaciones. Y hay otro elemento que seguro todos lo hemos visto, y es un mensaje que se ha venido popularizando, y es que no necesitas de educación superior, ¿no? Que, digamos, incluso algunos de estos de emprendimiento, estos grandes emprendedores, etcétera, que dicen, salte de educación superior, ¿no? Hay una vida afuera, ¿no? Estos mensajes yo creo que tenemos que revisarlos con mucho cuidado, porque a veces son promesas falsas, ¿no? Es basado en estudiantes y más o personas jóvenes que lograron metas en un corto plazo, pero a veces los pueden estar engañando sobre un futuro posible, solo que no los están dando la información completa de lo que puede generar la formación integral en educación superior. Entonces creo que ese es un tema también que valdría la pena que lo discutamos, porque no es solo muchos queriendo acceder, o sea, ¿qué está pasando con aquellos que pudiendo acceder no lo están haciendo? Eso por ahora, gracias.
Yeah. Excellent points, Elizabeth. Thank you. Abdullah, and then Miriam, I'll see if there's anything that you want to come in on before we wrap up. And Jasser, if he's back, I'll ask him as well. Abdullah.
Thank you very much. I want to compliment and put emphasis on what Isabel had just said by saying that we need to improve the perception, the image of higher education, because a lot of people think that higher education is elitist and that higher education will not solve their problem. That's why at the beginning of this conversation or this webinar, I'm saying that we need to link higher education to secondary TVET, because as far as we are very far from the two other subsectors, our image needs to be improved. That's why now, for instance, we need advocates by telling that all the three subsectors, they have a linkage. And when you are coming from technical vocational education, you can access to higher education. You can be tomorrow, for instance, an engineer, for instance. But as far as you know, higher education is for, let's say, professor, high professor, no. So this is the first point. The second point, we need to put emphasis on the relevance of higher education, taking into account the challenges the countries we are facing globally, locally, regionally, and globally. And finally, I think that we need also to, to make a strong advocacy toward the parliament, the politicians who are there to elaborate and to adopt the law, okay, to put emphasis on the relevance of higher education, because higher education is still suffering of the lack of funding, but the funding are discussed inside the parliament. So, and this has a direct linkage to the relevance, because the parliament want to put more money where they think that the issue of the country will be solved. Thank you. Over to you.
Yeah, Abdullah, absolutely agree. And I think when we again come back to the issues we talked about relating to advocacy, it reminds us about policy, sort of really trying to advocate for a longer term approach to policy and to planning, not simply thinking about, you know, what is the immediate need of society today, and, you know, what's going to win me the next election, if I can be a little bit cynical. Miriam, in closing, is there anything that you'd like to add or to come back on that we talked about already?
Just what has just been said at the end, advocacy. We need to do a lot of advocacy on ensuring that access to higher education is a right. So we need to do a lot of sensitization, advocating for, all that will make the right to higher education actually be a reality. So we need to have a clear strategy, clear campaign to ensure that the way we speak about access to primary education should be the way we speak about access to higher education as a right and not a privilege for a few. Thank you.
Well, those are such perfect words, I think, for us to finish with. Thank you, Miriam. But of course, thank you to everybody who's been on the panel today. Unfortunately, a couple of colleagues have had to move to the next meeting, but I think we've really all benefited from being able just to talk to each other about what are some of the issues, and finishing, as we will, with Miriam's points about advocacy. We've talked about advocacy and multiple levels. What is, advocating for better perceptions about what higher education is or could be, advocating for better information for students who might be coming into higher education, for better data about who's there and who's not there, for better policies that enable that kind of supportive environment, and advocating for student belonging for students who make it through these multiple barriers into higher education. So colleagues, thank you again so much for joining us today. Thank you very much to all the panelists. This has been really excellent. congratulations to you all on World Access to Higher Education Day 2022. And we hope to see you again very soon. So thank you very much and goodbye for today.
Thank you very much, Emma, for the
Bye,
organization.
Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam, Elizabeth, everybody.
Yes, thanks. Bye, everyone.
Yes. Bye. Okay,
Thank you.
great.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you very much, colleagues. Bye for now.